Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to be unraveling the incredible story of a figure who, quite literally, quietly redrew the geopolitical map of the Middle East. Her name? Gertrude Bell. Now, we all know the sweeping, dramatic historical epics of the First World War, right? But Bell is often the hidden, unexpected architect in those exact same narratives. She wasn't just a British colonial officer. She was an archaeologist and a deeply embedded intelligence agent whose intricate knowledge of the region completely shaped the structure of modern Iraq. Seriously, the borders she drew over a century ago, they are the exact same lines you're looking at on the news today. So let's jump right in and see exactly how she pulled this off. It's kind of staggering to think about, isn't it? How exactly did a female scholar working inside the intensely, famously male-dominated machinery of the early 20th century British Empire end up holding such unprecedented political power? I mean, this was a time when women back in England had barely even secured the right to vote. Yet there was Gertrude Bell, sitting in desert tents with powerful tribal leaders, making massive decisions that would literally chart out the future of entire nation-states. To wrap our heads around how she did this, we really just need to track her meteoric rise through British intelligence. Long before the war even started, Bell spent years traveling the region. She was out there learning Arabic and Persian and painstakingly mapping the incredibly harsh desert terrain. So when the First World War broke out, the British military desperately needed that specific knowledge. It was absolutely crucial. She joined the brand new Arab Bureau in Cairo in 1915, and from there, she just skyrocketed. By 1916, she's a political officer in Basra. A year later, she's the Oriental Secretary in Baghdad. And by 1921, she was the only woman invited by Winston Churchill to the super important Cairo conference. You know, to really grasp her unique role, it helps to compare her to her very famous contemporary, T.E. Lawrence. You probably know him as Lawrence of Arabia. So while Lawrence was out there as the highly visible field operative, leading those famous guerrilla warfare tactics on the battlefield, Bell was the ultimate behind-the-scenes strategist. Her intelligence work wasn't about blowing up trains. It was rooted in maps, incredibly detailed notes on tribal allegiances, and high-level political strategy. She was the one gathering the crucial, granular data that actually made those military operations and all the subsequent political maneuvering possible. Section 1. Baghdad's Oriental Secretary, the uncrowned queen. By 1917, Bell had made the move to Baghdad. And it's here that she really takes on this immense political influence, cementing her reputation in this remarkable, totally unprecedented new role. A huge part of her influence came through this incredibly dynamic partnership she had with her boss, Sir Percy Cox. Think of it this way. If Cox was the High Commissioner, the guy representing the formal, rigid administrative authority of the British Empire, Bell was his essential on-the-ground liaison. Because she actually spoke the languages and, crucially, understood the cultural nuances, she became Cox's primary bridge to the local Iraqi leaders. They basically operated as a powerhouse tandem, shaping British policy from the ground up. There's this one brilliant quote from a notable figure in Basra that perfectly nails their dynamic. He observed, "Sir Percy Cox has 40 ears and only one tongue." It's such a great way to explain how Bell and Cox functioned as a singular intelligence-gathering unit. Through Bell's absolute, relentless networking, they were soaking in massive amounts of local intelligence. They were mapping out exactly who held power, what they wanted, all while keeping their own cards very, very close to the chest. And the thing is, Bell wasn't gathering all this intel in some sterile, stuffy office. No, she was doing it over intimate afternoon teas. Picture this. While pouring cups of Earl Grey, she is constantly observing, categorizing, and analyzing everyone in the room. She regularly hosted prominent tribal leaders, like the powerful Shamar sheikhs, and she documented these encounters with intense precision. In her notes, she described a visiting leader's features as being drawn with amazing fineness and precision, a beautiful creature to look at. She was constantly evaluating every single individual, trying to figure out exactly how they could fit into the broader British strategy. Section 2. The demographic puzzle. Sunnis, Shias, and Kurds. So, as the British are sitting down to draw the borders of this entirely new Iraqi state, Bell finds herself navigating an incredibly fragile and complex sectarian landscape. Let's break down the territory they were trying to unite. It was roughly half Shiite Arabs, 20% Sunni Arabs, 20% Kurds, and the remaining 10% made up of other minority groups like Yazidis and Jews. Trying to unite these historically distinct groups with their own deep allegiances and religious ties, into one cohesive national identity under a British mandate? Well, it was a daunting and maybe even an entirely impossible puzzle to solve. So, how did Bell actually view these different groups? That's the crucial point here. According to the historical sources, she harbored some really deep-seated fears about the Shia majority. She was entirely convinced that, if left unchecked, they would essentially hijack the newly formed Constituent Assembly. She worried this would lead to what she explicitly called a Shia theocracy. On top of that, she was really stressed that radical clerics coming over from neighboring Persia would heavily influence Iraqi Shias and end up destabilizing British interests in the area. And her views on the Kurdish population up in the north? Just as complicated, honestly. She very frankly described the Kurds as being ungovernable. She saw them as this unruly, totally distinct ethnic group with a rich history of their own, one that was completely separate from the Arab populations down south. Yet here's where things get controversial. Even though she openly acknowledged that the Kurds had every right to self-determination and their own statehood, Bell made a heavily calculated political move. With that audacious kind of imperial map-making confidence, she actually advised that the Kurdish north be attached to the new Iraqi state anyway. Why do that? Well, it came down to pure imperial arithmetic. The British strategically needed to artificially boost the Sunni Muslim population within the borders. They needed a counterbalance against that Shia majority in the south. Basically, they prioritized British administrative control right over ethnic self-determination. Section 3. The 1920 White Paper, Self-Determination in Mesopotamia. Following the massive, violent 1920 Iraqi revolt against British rule, Bell had to pivot. She transitioned from being an intelligence gatherer into a high-level policymaker, and she was tasked with drafting a path forward for the empire. The result of that was her 1920 White Paper, which actually made her the first woman to ever write a report like this for the British Parliament. It summarized the whole turbulent situation from 1914 to 1920. But more importantly, it laid out a clear blueprint for the future. She advocated for Arab self-determination, but, and this is a big but, she crucially defined that as indirect administrative rule. In plain, everyday terms, this meant letting local leaders manage the day-to-day affairs as long as they stayed safely tucked within a broader British imperial framework. This exact document ended up heavily influencing the massive decisions that were just around the corner. Section 4. The Kingmaker, Crowning Faisal. Okay, so that 1921 Cairo conference we mentioned earlier, that is where Bell truly earns her title as Kingmaker. The British had just finished sketching out the borders of the new Kingdom of Iraq, and now they needed to actually put a ruler on the throne. This brings up a really obvious question, right? Why bypass the actual local Iraqi leaders who lived there? I mean, you had figures like Syed Talib, who were deeply, deeply rooted in local politics. Yet the British didn't just bypass him, they eventually went so far as to have him exiled. Instead of going local, Bell and the British administration looked outward and chose an outsider, King Faisal. So why Faisal? Well, he was a Hashemite from the Hijaz and famously a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, which instantly gave him immense religious prestige. Bell saw him as this resolute, highly charismatic Arab leader, exactly the kind of guy needed to unite a fractured country. But from a strategic standpoint, as an outsider, he was completely untangled from all those deep-seated local Iraqi feuds. And most importantly for Bell and Cox, he was pro-British. He was essentially the perfect figurehead to roll out what they call the Sharifian solution. This meant creating the very appealing illusion of independence while still safely keeping British influence pulling the strings behind the curtain. Now, to just write Bell off as a cold, calculating imperial agent wouldn't really be giving you the whole truth. When you read her letters, you uncover this really profound paradox in her life. She once wrote, "I'm more a citizen of Baghdad than many a Baghdadi born." She genuinely, deeply loved the region. She loved its history, and she loved its people. Yet this deep, very real affection was constantly, violently clashing with her fundamental day job as an agent of the British Empire, where her main task was securing British geopolitical interests above absolutely everything else. Section 5. The Uncrowned Queen's Legacy. As we move into the mid-1920s, the new Iraqi government was becoming a bit more established. Because of this, Bell's direct, day-to-day political influence started to wane a bit. So, she shifted that formidable, restless energy of hers toward a brand new passion. Recognizing the completely irreplaceable historical value of the region, she founded the Baghdad Museum. She literally worked tirelessly, out in the searing heat, sorting, cataloging, and protecting Iraq's ancient archaeological treasures. She became a fierce, relentless advocate for keeping these artifacts right there in the country, fighting against the trend of shipping them all off to European museums. She essentially secured a national cultural heritage for this brand new nation right up until her tragic death from an overdose of sleeping pills in 1926. Gertrude Bell leaves us with a deeply, deeply complex legacy. There is no denying she was a trailblazing woman. Her intellect and empathy let her navigate a world that was completely, utterly closed off to anyone else like her. But at the same time, those sectarian power structures she helped build and those map lines she drew to balance imperial spreadsheets, well, they set in motion conflicts that are still resonating a full century later. So, I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder today. Was Gertrude Bell the brilliant architect of a modern state, or was she the author of tragic imperial borders? Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer, and keep questioning the history that shapes our world today.